This is the AI Brief, brought to you by the YPO Technology Network, and I'm Stephen Forte. This weekend, I want to talk about something a lot of CEOs are still misreading. Not AI tools, not prompt engineering, not whether your team should use co-pilots. I want to talk about the layoffs, because if you read the last few months of headlines the old way, you miss what is actually happening. And after watching a lot of companies try to adopt AI, some thoughtfully, some theatrically, some successfully, some not, the pattern is getting easier to see. Here's the line that should make you sit up a little straighter. We are not making this decision because we are in trouble. Our business is strong. That was Jack Dorsey at Block when he announced major cuts and made it clear this was not a rescue mission. It was a redesign. That distinction matters. For years, when we saw layoffs, we all used basically the same mental model. Revenue is soft. Margins are under pressure. Guidance is ugly. Something broke and now the company is cutting to compensate. That model still exists. But it is not the model that explains what many of the top tech companies are doing right now. What we are watching is not just cost control, it is organizational rewiring. And if you run a mid-market company, this matters a lot because the dangerous response is to think, well, we're healthy, so we can wait. That logic made sense in 2009. It made sense in parts of 2023. It does not make nearly as much sense now. This is not 2009 when companies were cutting because the music had stopped and the numbers forced their hand. And this is not really 2023 either, when a lot of companies were unwinding the overhiring hangover from the post-COVID boom. What we are seeing now is something colder and frankly, more important. Strong companies are looking at AI and concluding that parts of the org chart were designed for an older information system. That is the story. Not AI might make people more efficient, not teams should experiment with ChatGPT, not some tasks can be automated. The real story is that companies are starting to ask a more uncomfortable question. If intelligence gets cheaper, faster, and more available, which parts of our organization are still essential, and which parts only existed because human beings used to be the only way to move context around? That is a much bigger question. And once you see it, a lot of the headlines look different. They stop looking like bad weather. They start looking like early architecture. The simple framework I use for this is healthy company layoffs can now be a leading indicator of redesign, not just a lagging indicator of weakness. That is why I think a lot of the commentary has missed the mark. Analysts and journalists still tend to treat layoffs as a lagging indicator of weakness. Sometimes they are, but in this cycle, many of them are also a leading indicator of redesign. That is a different category entirely. If you are a CEO, the practical implication is simple. Your P&L may not give you an obvious forcing function before your competitors begin changing the operating model underneath you. And if you wait for pain, you may be waiting too long. Now, let me make this more concrete. The most useful thing Dorsey and others have done is not just cut. It is that they have said the quiet part out loud. The old management hierarchy was, in many cases, an information routing system. One layer gathered context, another layer translated it, another layer approved it, another layer reviewed the approval. Then someone scheduled a meeting so everyone could align on the fact that nothing had been decided yet. That is not a joke, by the way. That is Tuesday at a surprising number of otherwise successful companies. For a long time, that structure made sense. Information was expensive. Context was trapped in people, meetings, inboxes, and departmental silos. Human managers were the routing layer, but AI changes the economics of routing, synthesis, retrieval, and first-pass judgment. So now the question becomes, if software can increasingly gather the context, summarize the context, compare options, flag anomalies, and recommend next actions, what exactly should the human layers be doing? That does not mean managers disappear. It does mean coordination as a job is in trouble. That is the part I think a lot of executives intuitively understand, but have not yet said plainly. And before this turns into one of those breathless burn the org chart monologues, let me say the opposite. Most companies should not copy Block. That would be a very expensive misunderstanding. One reason I say that with some confidence is that the pattern is pretty consistent. The companies that get real traction with AI usually have already done the less glamorous operating work first. Block has structural advantages that most mid-market companies do not. It is highly digital. It has dense product and transaction data. It has a culture that leaves a lot of written artifacts behind. In other words, the business is already producing the raw material an intelligence layer can use. Most companies listening to this are not sitting on that exact setup. If you run manufacturing, distribution, healthcare services, field services, B2B software, insurance, logistics, professional services, or anything with partial digitization and lots of human exception handling, you cannot just grab the headline and copy the move. If you try, you do not get transformation, you get organizational whiplash. You cut management before building a better coordination system. You remove meetings before creating better visibility. You tell everyone to use AI, and 6 weeks later, all you have is a new layer of theater. Same dysfunction, new vocabulary. So what should a sane CEO do instead? I think the right move is not to start with layoffs at all. It is to start with diagnosis. And I mean operator diagnosis, not innovation theater diagnosis. Before you talk about removing layers, ask 3 questions. First, where does your company's real operating knowledge actually live today? Is it in systems? Is it in documents? Is it in dashboards? Or is it mostly in a handful of long-tenured people who know which customer will explode, which plant always runs late, which vice president can unblock legal, and which forecast number nobody really believes? Second, which workflows in your company are basically coordination masquerading as management? Not leadership, not judgment, not coaching. I mean the work that is mostly chasing updates, reconciling versions, translating one team's language into another, forwarding context, assembling slide decks for decisions that should have been made 3 days ago, and sitting in meetings that exist mainly because nobody trusts the system of record. That category is much larger than most companies admit. Third, where would faster decision cycles actually matter commercially? Not in theory, in your business. Pricing exceptions, customer support escalations, supply chain changes, sales approvals, implementation delays, forecast revisions. Because the point is not to deploy AI in the abstract. The point is to compress the time between signal understanding and action in places that matter to customers and cash flow. That is where the opportunity is. And in practice, this is usually where good operators separate themselves from people giving speeches about the future. Now, if I were advising a mid-market CEO on what to do in the next 90 days, I would keep it very simple. Step 1, pick 2 workflows, not 20. Pick workflows that are painful, frequent, measurable, and full of coordination drag. For example, deal desk approvals, support escalations, project status reporting, invoice exception handling, weekly operating reviews, or customer onboarding handoffs. If a workflow requires 5 people to assemble context before one person can make a decision, you have found a good candidate. Step 2, make the workflow legible. This sounds boring, which is usually a sign that it matters. Map the actual inputs, decisions, exceptions, owners, systems, and bottlenecks. What triggers the work? What information is needed? Where does it live? Who decides? What causes delay? What gets reworked? What gets escalated? What is still being managed through Slack archaeology and calendar archaeology? You do not need a grand theory yet. You need visibility. Step 3, run in shadow mode. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see. Companies jump from curiosity to authority too quickly. The better pattern is simple. Let the system observe, summarize, recommend, and compare. Keep the human making the decision. Measure the gap. Where is the system right? Where is it fast but shallow? Where does it miss nuance? Where does it catch things humans miss because humans are tired, rushed, or 3 meetings into a bad afternoon? That evidence base matters. It also gives you something many AI programs are missing: actual operating proof inside your own business before you start redesigning around assumptions. Step 4, separate leadership from coordination. This is subtle, but it is huge. A lot of companies talk about protecting managers or removing managers as if that is one thing. It is not. Some managers are real leaders. They coach, they hire, they develop judgment. They handle conflict. They see around corners. They make hard trade-offs. Others are functioning mostly as air traffic control for broken information flows. AI is much more likely to pressure the second category than the first. That is why the right question is not, how many managers do we need? It is, which parts of management are actually leadership and which parts are expensive middleware? That question tends to quiet a room, usually for good reason. Step 5, create an explicit decision rights map. In plain English, what can a system recommend? What can it do with approval? And what must remain fully human? If you do not define this, one of 2 things happens. Either the AI gets treated like a toy and nothing changes, or people start trusting it in inconsistent ways, and you create a much weirder kind of operational risk. Neither is ideal. And step 6, turn overrides into learning. This is where the compounding starts. Every time a human says, no, not that customer, or no, not this supplier, or no, the dashboard is technically right but commercially wrong, that correction should improve the system. That is the loop. Not demo, applause, pilot, and forget. Observe, recommend, compare, correct, improve repeatedly. That is how a company actually gets smarter. Now, a quick word on what I would stop doing immediately. I would stop using status meetings as the default operating system. Not all meetings. Some meetings are absolutely worth having. But if a meeting exists mainly so people can report facts, reconcile whose spreadsheet is current, or verbally reassemble context that should already be visible, that is not leadership. That is a system failure with snacks. The meeting should be for judgment, conflict, trade-offs, and exceptions. The machine should do more of the gathering. The humans should do more of the deciding. That is the redesign. And this is why I do think the clock is real. Not because every company is about to slash headcount next quarter. Not because every org chart is obsolete overnight. Not because every AI deck on LinkedIn suddenly became true. The clock is real. Because once one company in your category starts learning faster than the rest, that advantage compounds quietly. Better response times, better exception handling, better pricing discipline, better forecasting, fewer dropped handoffs, more decisions made at the edge with good context. None of that looks dramatic in week 1, but give it 4 quarters and it starts to show up everywhere, in margins, in customer experience, in talent density, in speed, in how much management energy gets spent pushing information uphill versus improving the business. That is why I think the most important mistake a CEO can make right now is to treat this as a tooling conversation. It is not mainly a tooling conversation. You can buy tools quickly. What takes time is building an organization that produces usable context, trusts the right systems, and learns from its own decisions. That is harder. It is also where the advantage lives. So here is the mirror I would hold up this weekend. If your company is healthy, that is not a reason to delay this work. It may be the best reason to start it. If you wait until the numbers force a redesign, you will redesign from pressure. If you start while the business is strong, you can redesign from choice. That is a very different posture. You do not need to begin with a dramatic headcount move. You do not need a grand AI reorg announcement. You do not need a 40-page manifesto. Frankly, most companies would settle for a reliable system of record and fewer meetings that could have been a dashboard. That would already be progress. But you do need to begin. Pick 2 workflows, map them properly, run shadow mode, define decision rights, learn from overrides, then scale what actually works. That is a much better executive move than either complacency or theater, because that is the real choice now. Not human versus machine, not old economy versus new economy. The real choice is whether you redesign your company deliberately while you still have time, or wait until the market, the labor model, and your competitors make the design choices for you. That is the AI Brief Weekend Edition for Saturday, April 18th, 2026. I'm Stephen Forte. I'll be back Monday. Until then, stay sharp.